So thanks everyone for coming today. This is our 5th Sustainability Guild workshop. And these workshops are a collaboration between the student-led Oxford Climate Society and Bart Ashton, who is the bursar at LMH and just a force for good for everything climate related at Oxford. I think he's on this chat today. And so in the past, we've had workshops already on writing carbon targets, on sustainable food and buildings and energy, and we upload all the resources from the workshops afterwards. So sometimes this is a video, sometimes this is kind of handouts and PowerPoint slides from our speakers. But today we've collected some case studies of some successful conferences that we'll be sending around afterwards, and documents with information about all the different available technological options that we have for virtual conferences. And we'll be in touch about the next workshop afterwards. So at today's workshop, I'm delighted to welcome 3 speakers, experts on virtual conference approaches. So first, we'll hear from Professor Ken Hiltner, who is Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And he directs the Environmental Humanities Initiative there, and has also pioneered the NCN, or Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference approach, which we will be hearing about today. So look forward to hearing more about that. And then we will also hear from Celia Popovic, who is Director of the Teaching Commons at York University, and who has written a number of articles about digital learning, as well as editing the 2018 book, Learning from Academic Conferences. So we look forward to hearing some tips about putting on virtual academic conferences. And finally, we will hear from our very own Peter Robinson, who is Project Manager at the Learning Technologies Group at Oxford University IT Services. And Peter also managed the first video conferencing service at Oxford over 20 years ago, so it's been in it from the beginning. So we will, after each talk, get a few questions. So I think we normally have questions immediately after the talk rather than the end, so people can keep in their mind what was just said. And I look forward to learning a lot about this, especially because these workshops now probably will be virtual conferences, so something that's very applicable for me as well. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Ken.
And you can hear me okay, Eleanor? See me?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, great. So first, thank you to Eleanor and Alice and everyone for coordinating this. And also, as with all virtual events, we may have a few technical difficulties. I don't think it's going to be anything with streaming, but my 5-year-old daughter is running around the garden here, and if she pops into the middle of the conference, there might be a problem. But so yeah, I'm from the University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB. And the University of California system has an interesting distinction, and that is back in 2011, the chancellor of the president really of the entire UC, which comprises over 10 campuses, put a mandate for us that we should, as a university system, as a major university system, be carbon neutral by 2025. And when that first happened, I think everyone was bewildered how it could possibly work, because, you know, we're talking about all the buildings, all the dormitories, food, cafeteria, labs, everything, including the vehicle fleet. No one quite knew how to do it, but we've worked at it, and it seems likely that at least a few of the UC campuses, including my own, will be carbon neutral by 2025. In a few years, hopefully you're going to hear that this in fact happened. But what you probably won't hear is what I want to talk about today is sort of the dirty little secret behind all this. And that is to even have that goal of being carbon neutral, we had to break out what we call scope 3 emissions. And those are travel emissions from air travel as well as commuting, faculty and staff commuting to campus and flying around. Astonishingly, they comprised about 40% of total emissions for the campus. So you can see by breaking these out, this goal is not quite the goal we would think it would be. You might think a lot of that is commuting, and in fact it is. And Santa Barbara is kind of isolated up the coast here. So if you don't live in Santa Barbara proper or one of the immediate communities, you have like at least a half-hour, 45-minute commute. And yet that is only 8% of the equation. about a third of all emissions for our campus, and that's inclusive of everything, housing, cafeteria, everything, comes from air travel. To put a number on that, it's 55 million pounds of CO2 or equivalent gases every year, and that's just this one campus, you know. And to put that in human terms, that's about a city of 27,000 people in the Philippines who have just about where we all should be, total emissions to reach the goal set forth in COP 21. So an astonishing amount of emissions. And it was fascinating to me because, as Eleanor noted, I'm a humanities person, not a scientist. So when, you know, we've talked about how to, you know, to reduce the electricity or supply electricity to the campus and all, I was sort of bewildered how all that would happen with, you know, how you install solar energy and all. But it seemed to me that this was a particularly, well, not a simple problem, but certainly a humanities problem, insofar as it seems unlikely you're going to come up with some sort of carbon neutral aircraft traveling 7/8 of the speed of sound at any point in the near future at all. So telepresencing seems to be the thing. And even in 2011, and certainly today, you know, the capability is already there, right? You know, we all carry it around in their back pockets, right? 2 billion people on the planet carry smartphones that can deliver high definition video and can also film high definition video, really broadcast standards. So the issue then is how to get people to go along with this. And from my point of view, and I also do a lot of work with social justice and climate justice, there's the other issue here that, you know, the traditional academic conference is problematic for a range of reasons other than just environmental. What I mean by that is, for example, you know, most people across the planet can never attend an academic conference in North America or the EU. And in fact, for most of people on the planet, you know, the cost of airfare to North America or the EU from anywhere else on the planet is often greater than the per capita income of those countries, which means that we've quietly, summarily, you know, eliminated from the conversation a huge number of scholars across the planet. And, you know, understandably, this had to happen 100 years ago, I guess. But now we have the ability to bring everyone into the conversation. There are other things that can make a huge difference, and one would, of course, be accessibility. You know, traditional academic conference, you know, if there's an issue of vision or hearing, you know, how do you handle that? But with the approach we take, which is an asynchronous approach, first, we make sure all the videos are pre-recorded in advance, which also makes streaming more reliable insofar as the latency that there can normally be a problem with streaming, and that is you may even encounter it with my talk. If you don't have a solid internet connection at either end, it'll break up, you'll go just to audio or something. But if you stream it, it allows your browser to start buffering, and that's of course what makes, you know, Netflix and all possible, and YouTube as well. So that's an advantage. But the other thing is, by pre-recording in advance, YouTube now has very reasonably accurate closed captioning technology. It happens automatically through voice recognition, but we ask all the participants in our conferences to make sure that the accuracy is there to go through and edit it. And it is also possible, the way we set up our websites, to make them more accessible and open to a variety of readers that people would use if they have a problem with vision. So, you know, in two ways, right off the bat, it becomes far more accessible to do an event like this. Forget about the environmental implications for a minute, which is, you know, that's where I started. But you can see there are other advantages. Another one would be if you do events the way we do when they're asynchronous, and if you think about what I just said, by confirming that the closed captioning is accurate, we've also have accurate transcripts for every talk given. These are not just sort of, you know, bullet points or notes from which the talk is given, which may vary. But in this case, so Eleanor said you'll be recording this. If this goes up on YouTube, you will have a transcript of my talk. Every talk will be available. And if you think about that for a moment, it suddenly means that conference proceedings, in the sense of an edition, a volume published from those conferences, becomes in a way kind of irrelevant, or at least, you could compile it together kind of as a list of what's been presented, or sort of the most significant one for whatever reason from the conference. But this also opens it up to the world. And I always think back, one of my advisors, my dissertation advisors, a guy named Stephen Greenblatt, held a very important conference at Berkeley, at the University of California at Berkeley, back in, I think, 1980. And he introduced there the concept of what has become known as New Historicism. And in my field, cultural and literary analysis, New Historicism became enormously influential for a number of decades. And the interesting thing is, the people who were actually at that conference back in 1980, fewer than 100 of them, half of them had earth-shattering books, really important books, because they saw and realized that this was something really important brewing, and they got on sort of at the ground floor. But the fact is, most people were delayed from that. They didn't actually get the word about New Historicism until those books started appearing years after the conference. With an approach like ours, it means that everyone, anywhere, can be at the epicenter of an event, right there in real time, and see exactly what's happening. This can be anyone, anywhere on the planet, and of course, it also means that the privileging that has gone to the conference activity is not just for the people who are fortunate enough to attend those events. So the way I've just framed it in the last few minutes, this is really great for people who can afford to travel to places where this is happening, where an important conference is happening. But it also means that this is far more democratic insofar as any place in the world can stage a conference like this. So with our approach, we set it up so that it was all based on kind of, I won't say antiquated technology, but not cutting edge technology. What I mean by that is, you can set up one of our conferences by way of WordPress on a site pretty much anywhere. 2/3 of the internet now runs with WordPress, so that's usually not a difficulty for people. And there are few costs associated with it because, it's all been monetized by YouTube, which we use as our streaming provider, because they have ways of, selling ads and all. Ads don't get sold for our conference, but what it means is we can stream them right to a WordPress site very simply. And what it really means in practice is that any group can put together a conference for pretty much nothing, insofar as the only cost of setting it up, as opposed to actually having a physical event where you have venues and dinners and accommodations and all. The actual cost of setting it up is just setting up a WordPress website. And again, that's kind of like a blog website. The cost of production of the actual talks, there isn't much there either, because we offload that to the person actually presenting the talk. What I mean is, each person records their talk, and it can be as simply as using a webcam on your laptop. In fact, we had a great talk at one of our conferences, which was Bill McKibben, and he just presented it. He just did it from his webcam. The video quality wasn't quite there, but it nonetheless was great to actually have it. And it also means that you don't even need a laptop to do this, right? Because the best video that you can get from a device that you own right now is probably not your laptop or your desktop computer, or arguably, even if you have an external webcam, the best video that you can get is from your smartphone. So not the one that actually faces you, if you use FaceTime or something like that, but the other one, the one you take pictures with. They're almost all very high definition, like 4K resolution now. They almost all have very high frame rates and all. So anybody can produce a film and put it up on YouTube for zero cost. And it also is important because, if we're doing this from an environmental point of view, we don't want to have people buying a huge number of devices and all, and having a huge, environmental footprint. You have everything you need. Everyone has everything they need right now, which is what strikes me so interesting about this issue. And going back to where I started with, the University of California, we couldn't figure out how to address this issue. And as a consequence, it got taken off of the table. So to put that, to go back to what I said is, by 2025, the university will become carbon neutral. but not flying and travel, that's been put off to 2050. And I think it was thought that maybe there'd be some way of, new type of aircraft and all at that point. But from my point of view, this is not a scientific, technological problem. This is a cultural problem. Because when you actually look at it and you stand back, and if you were to tell two people, to tell someone, I have two approaches to doing a conference. If they had never been to a conference, knew nothing about a conference, which sounds better? One that would allow anybody on the planet to stage and attend the conference, one that would provide a lasting archive of the conference, one that would allow people with any sort of accessibility issue to attend, one that, would eliminate a huge amount of discomfort and travel and all. It seemed very clear. Most people would say, well, this approach makes a lot more sense. Even from the point of view, people often raise this with me, well, what happens if you go up for a merit review at your university? Does that mean that, does this count? Does it not count? Arguably, this should count far more. And the reason for that is because, there's a lasting archive of what you've done. Having, been in many merit reviews myself, you look at, and this is for tenure or anything else, you look at the accomplishments of some person, and all you see on that CV is a line that they attended this conference at such and such a time in such and such a place. Well, that's not really a lot to go by. But here you actually get to see the entire talk, to get to read the entire talk. And another really important point about this is the way we structured it. So if you've kind of followed what we've done, it's up on YouTube, it's on WordPress, you can stream the videos. We put usually 3 or 4 of them together, and we make that into a panel talk. And then we have a Q&A. The Q&A is a written Q&A, and it's just basically, and most people are familiar with this, it's a forum, like an online forum, like the comment section on YouTube, really. And it's important because it allows people to interact, and we usually keep these conferences open for 3 weeks. It allows people to interact even if they can't do it in real time. So if I were participating in this conference this way, even though you folks are 7,000 miles from me, and I'm actually at 9 a.m. when I'm talking now, you could pose a question at any time, and then I would be able to answer a question at any time, whatever is convenient for me. And in fact, the way we set up the software is whenever someone poses a question or answers a question to your Q&A, your particular Q&A, you actually get an email sent to you. And the email actually has the question in its entirety right there. So if you want to think about it for a moment, or you could even respond to it on your smartphone, you can do it. It's so much better than attending a conference where you may have very little interest in what's going on. The other advantages too is just that. So you attend a typical conference like this, and some of you may be waiting for me to get finished for other speakers, and I understand. You have to sit through panels to do that. But with our approach, you don't have to do that, right? You can just watch the talks that you want. You can scrub through the talks that you want. And if you're ever going to YouTube, you may have noticed that YouTube has transcripts of the talks available. You can just, if you go down to the bottom underneath of the video, you'll have an option there to view the transcript. You can actually, if you were watching my talk there, you wouldn't have to sit through the whole talk. You could literally read it. You can read it, of course, far more quickly than I can go through. Or the way YouTube works, which is one of the reasons we like them as a streaming source. We originally used Vimeo, but YouTube is just far superior, in part because they have localized versions in over 80 countries now, and a very robust network. But you can just go ahead and find a particular line that you find interesting, click on it, and you will be moved to that part of the video immediately so that you can watch just that. All these things strike me as enormously powerful and to be blunt, far more powerful than traditional conferences. When you actually look at the carbon footprint, and we've staged like 5 or 6 of these events in the last 5 years, we've saved literally for single events over 250,000 pounds of CO2 or equivalent gases, sometimes far more. And we've also had a range of places represented that just wouldn't have been represented before. In fact, one conference we had, 5 continents represented. And I can tell you in practical terms, it's been absolutely wonderful. So we actually had a conference going on when our most recent president, Donald Trump, was actually voted into office. And the morning after, I posted a small video asking what people thought. And the first response immediately was, the first responses actually were coming in from South America, which if that had been a traditional conference that happened to have been at that time here in California, that wouldn't have happened. But as it turned out, the discussion that ensued regarding what was happening in the United States and in particular Argentina at that time was amazing, really. The other thing about it, that particular talk, even though it was like a 3-minute talk that I put up, had 19,000 words of commentary, of Q&A back and forth. On average, our written Q&As, because they take over 3 weeks and people have more time to consider their comments, they can be longer, and discussions tend to be a lot longer. In fact, on average, 3 times longer. But we've had some conferences where we've had talks, the Q&As alone, that were 10 to 15 times longer than a traditional Q&A. And you can see that, right? Because I'm going to finish pretty soon. And after that, you can have a discussion with me that'll last for like 10 minutes. But imagine having that discussion take place over 3 weeks where, you may think of something to ask me after those 10 minutes are over. You might be, walking home and thinking about it. But, here you have that option. You have the option to put it together more carefully. And, as a literary scholar, I'm really interested in the difference between written text and spoken. And written text has an accuracy to it that you're just not going to get otherwise. And now in the 21st century, we also have the ability to put links in it, so you can actually send people out to other things to reference and all. So the experience that we've had with this is that generally it has been very successful among the people who've taken it. And we sometimes do exit polls for the events, and we've asked them, for example, was the lack of direct human contact really that big of a loss? And I mentioned that one because that's like the number one question I get asked. We always get asked. The first event, I think, was 87% of people said it was not a significant loss, that the kind of relationships that people built online made up for that loss. And that was especially the case. And we did when we did the polls, I was curious how it worked, but especially for people sort of, newer in career who are more familiar with sort of online interaction, millennials and the generation after them. Because, of course, a lot of, for different people, it doesn't always skew with age, but for a lot of people, a lot of their lives take place online. In fact, I read a statistic that said that most interactions that people, that meant that I went my length of time, that most interactions that happen on YouTube happen with people who are within 25 miles of each other. So even though people could very easily, drive over to see someone, you have a lot of interaction happening online. And what we're suggesting is really that we think of the conference as kind of a form of online social media, a short-lived form by comparison, but one in which people can interact and, have meaningful conversations. So there I went, 20 minutes. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much for that really interesting talk. For questions, do people want to write them in the chat? Actually, I think that's probably the easiest way of doing it.
Sure.
Unless, actually, what would you like to do, Ken? Given that you actually have done lots of virtual conferences before.
Well, most of ours are asynchronous. So I am looking at the chat now. No questions yet. So if someone wants to jump right in with a spoken one, or I have the chat here if you want to pop one in here as well.
Could I ask one actually, maybe while people are thinking?
Sure.
Which was, I was just wondering if you did anything special to try and get sort of the networking going between people when, like, I don't know, encouraging them to meet up over video, or encouraging people, like what are the tools that you can put in place to allow people to do that you lose when you switch to virtual?
Yeah. Well, one thing that people asked for, because if you follow what I said, ours is entirely an asynchronous event. So even the opening talks and all are pre-recorded. People felt that they could be more perhaps interaction like this, real time. So for one of the events, two of the events actually, we set up what I called NCN salons, which were on-time, real-time events like this, but broken into three time zones, three big time zones across the planet. So for example, one was open for North and South America because from the very east to the very west of the planet, if you time it right, you could schedule a 1 hour event that would be kind of work for everyone during business hours. The EU and Africa was another one, and that kind of stretched into Asia a little bit, then all of Asia and Australia and New Zealand were another. That didn't work out that well. People just didn't seem that interested in doing that real-time interaction. So the other approach, and it's a great question, Eleanor, is that we basically set up this community formed during this event. And again, it's kind of like social media. We allowed that to continue on afterwards. So anybody who wanted to continue and wanted all the information to share and all had done that. What we haven't done, and we've thought about, and it kind of speaks directly to your question, is having, and this would be an unusual thing for a conference, but to have follow-up events like every 3 months, every 6 months, every year or so, where people could kind of, who were interested, maybe were doing work and all, could reconvene and talk about it. The nice thing about doing an approach like this, that's all pretty simple. And in fact, we leave our WordPress archive up so that it'd be very easy to just add another page for that, right? So someone could come on, one of the coordinators, and give a brief talk, and then open up a new discussion area there. That definitely could be done.
Great, thank you. I think we have a comment now.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a great question. So the question, I guess you're all looking at it here, is regarding the talk being not scripted. Some people script them, and the other thing to keep in mind, I just did this entirely as a spoken thing. People can do presentations simultaneously. So we have had people maybe a little camera shy or whatever, who did it entirely like as a PowerPoint or Prezi, where you don't actually see the speaker at all, you just see that. You can. But it raises a great question because conference talks have typically been a sort of ephemera, right? And this is speaking the question here. In that, after the talk is done, it's beginning to fade in everyone's mind. There's generally not a physical record of it unless maybe conference proceedings. Maybe someone takes notes during them, but I very rarely see conference talks referenced in books or articles. As a consequence, it sort of just fades. Within like a month, people have probably forgotten most of the talk except for maybe central ideas, and you kind of wait for it to make an appearance in a text somewhere as an article. But these are not ephemera, what we're talking about here. These are lasting things. They are lasting archives. It's lasting archive with lasting transcripts, and that changes things a little. And some people are a little made anxious by it because you accept the idea that if you give a talk and you do something that's really embarrassing or it doesn't work out, that people will forget about it. That's kind of like a key thing. People don't forget about these because they're there. And it does change the way we think about them. And again, for like review committees and all, this actually archives everything. So it is solid in a way it isn't. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the other one, it's disruptive and challenging development for the commercial existence of conference venues in general. Yeah, well, first, we've seen now during COVID-19, the airline industry has been hit dramatically. And, in the United States alone, 200 million people travel to conferences and similar events every year. If we were to shift these all online, which we've done, that would disrupt that industry. In most major cities, there are huge conference halls and events and caterers and everything. That would have to change too. But to put it back in perspective, for many scholars, they are literally doubling their carbon and climate footprint by way of air travel. And, you know, you can have a hybrid car, you can eat a largely, you know, plant-based diet, you can do all sorts of things to help reduce your carbon footprint. This could and is going to potentially completely blow it. And I'm afraid, and I know this isn't a very rewarding answer, but if we are to actually live sustainably, there are many industries that are going to have to radically change and in some cases go away. This has become very controversial and in the news in the United States in the last, you know, 3 or 4 years, where the coal industry came under attack from our last presidential competitor, Hillary Clinton, who said that industry has to go away. We will retrain those people and build a new industry to make sustainable energy and all. And of course, our president has defiantly, you know, said, no, we want to keep it. Well, that's sort of a shot across the bow. There are all sorts of industries that are environmentally problematic that have to change significantly. And I think the conference industry, that's going to have to happen. And I know that's easy to say, and I don't mean to say it in an insensitive way to all the people who are employed by it, but there are many things that we do, and air travel is one of them that have to be radically rethought. You know? Yep. You probably read this, you're reading it too. If the conference is pre-recorded and available for 3 weeks, how do you get people to tune in at the start of the conference so they can participate? Well, we have a couple of little tricks we do. One, we actually have a timer set on the homepage of the conference, and it's a countdown. And it says 3 days, 4 hours, and 12 minutes, the conference will start. And then once the conference starts, we reset that, you know, in 21 days, the conference will end. So we try to get people involved in it. And then, of course, one of my jobs as conference coordinator, which is it's a whole different kind of job as a traditional conference coordinator. I have to go around and send out emails and try to get people participating and all. But generally, once the pump is sort of primed and it gets going, and people are beginning to get emails on their phone that they're getting questions to their panel, usually things get going. But it all depends on the panel, and I think that's been my experience with traditional conferences as well. I've been to panels where 3 or 4 people showed up for the whole, you know, discussion. That was it. I've been to others where 30 or 40 or more, and it was very lively. It all depends. But yeah, we definitely can do that. Yep. Yeah, it's the best thing to do to go to your YouTube channel. Yeah, I think so. But even better, just Google my name or just Google Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference. You'll be taken to my personal website, and there's something I call our NCN white paper. And that's what I've done is I've tried to write down everything I could think of for people who want to duplicate this. And you can do it all, you know, I don't charge for it. It's all free of charge. You can do it. But also at the very beginning, the first paragraph, you'll get links to actual conferences that we've done. So the YouTube videos are the backbone of it, but the conference website kind of organizes it, so you can actually visit a panel and see those. So I think that's probably the best way to go about it. Yeah. So the sharing the resources, yeah, we've definitely that's how to do it. You can see all that as well. Semi-virtual conferences, yeah. So as you may imagine, we've been doing this for like 5 years, and there's been interest here and there. But when COVID-19 hit and conferences were being disrupted everywhere, suddenly my inbox blew up. And there are a number of people doing this now, working on what are being called like hybrid events, where some of the participants will be in real time, some not. I've never been a fan of that approach because I don't want it to seem as if there is a real conference taking place in real time and this other thing going on. I want everyone to feel, even though you're in another part of the world altogether, you're equally participating on the same footing, and it doesn't matter if you have a visual impairment or anything like that. Everyone is sort of on the same thing. But yeah, so my thought is I'm a little hesitant on the idea, but I am really anxiously awaiting to see how these events actually work. Yeah. Oh, and thanks, Eleanor, for putting that up. So there is the link at the bottom of the chat, and that will take you to the guide, and that will take you to actual conferences. You can actually attend these conferences and see. Well, what does happen at the end of 3 weeks, we turn off the Q&A so that people can't comment anymore. And then what is left is a lasting archive. Yeah. Eleanor, do I have time to answer this one last question? I
Sorry,
can't hear you. Are you still?
Sorry about that. Yes, we have time for one last. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, that is a question. So sometimes there is confidential material. I never really thought much about this, but a few years ago, I spent a year as a visiting professor at Princeton, and I saw this poster show of undergraduate posters who were working with renewable technology and all. And immediately, the poster show opened, and someone came in and shut the whole thing down because they were making public resource material that ultimately may have resulted in patents or other things. So they didn't want this material broadly disseminated. That is a different mindset than mine, because I'm in the humanities. We want everybody to get everything all the time. But if it's the case, it's not a problem, of course, because you can, using YouTube or Vimeo or other streaming sources, you can actually set the material to private so that only people who have a link can do it. And if you're even more concerned about it, don't use a streaming source. Use your own server, like if your university has a server, and lock down everything behind a password. And in that case, you're as good as any other, university security, if that is a concern. And I think for some people, yeah. Do people get, I'll ask the final question here. No, we don't charge participants. Everything's free. And that's another thing, because there's really no reason to charge them, because it's not a lot of costs associated with doing it. People can get a little overwhelmed because there's a lot there. But the other thing about it, though, is it's not like you have to make a commitment to a talk or even a panel. You can just kind of go through and see what's interesting, kind of read it a little and listen. So, but it's a great point, and maybe it's a great one to end on, that culturally this is different. And from my point of view as a humanities person, we're talking about a shift in a cultural practice. And that's different than a technological shift, but in some ways, every bit is sort of earth-shattering and difficult. You have to kind of be on board for that. You have to sort of open up that we're going to be doing something new here, and be willing to play with that and to see how it goes. And I think if people are, and they give it a fair chance, because, again, for all the equitable reasons and all, and for the huge, it's a third of the carbon footprint of my campus, all this flying. I mean, we really need to think hard about this, and for better or worse, I guess a silver lining, if there could possibly be one to COVID-19, is that it's gotten us thinking about virtual conferences and more generally telepresencing. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that talk, and for telling us about the MCN approach, something I really hadn't heard about much before, so it's really great to hear. I think we should probably move on to our next speaker, which is Celia Popovic, but great. Thanks, Ken.
Okay, take care.
Thanks. Bye. Yeah, so sorry, handing over to you, Celia. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. Ellen, is it possible to share the slides? It just helps, they're not earth-shattering, but it just helps me to...
Yeah, sorry, did I...
do something? Do I need to...
Sorry,
share screen? Oh, you have put that.
Yeah, there you go. It should work now.
Okay, I've got share screen, and then I just need to find the right thing to share with you. Can you see? I'm not sure what you're seeing.
We can see your PowerPoint.
Okay, so can you see me? Because I'm okay. Right, hello, hi. So I'm Celia Popovic. I'm an associate professor at York University in Toronto. I'm no longer the director of the Teaching Commons, but I was until last year. So
sorry,
I'm just a regular prof now. No, not at all. I missed that job. It was good. Anyway, the reason for even mentioning it. Oh, no, I just put a picture of me in looking silly because I wasn't sure if my camera would work, and I may have to switch it off because I don't have great internet connections. So if someone could tell me, I don't know how you tell me if you can't hear me, but anyway. As Eleanor mentioned, I've had a long interest in conferences. I used to be in the UK, and I've been in Canada for nearly 10 years now. And in both countries, I've been involved in, my professional background is educational developer, which means, in a nutshell, working with faculty on teaching and learning. And my professional organisation in both the UK and in Canada has a tradition of having an annual in-person conference, and it's really important. It's a really important event, not just for sharing information, which is clearly really important, but for networking. A lot of developers work maybe one or only two people in an institution, and to get together and meet other people has always been really important. So conferences have been at the heart, really, of some of the work I've done. And I edited a book on conferences 2 years ago, which doesn't have an awful lot on online conferences. So already it needs another chapter. Anyway, the reason that I think that I was asked to talk to you is because of the experience of organising one of these annual conferences last year in 2019. Normally, as I say, these are online conferences, and it was nothing to do with COVID. We never heard the word, and it wasn't actually directly to do with climate change either, although that was a benefit. The main reason for going online on this particular occasion was that we had a model where people volunteered to host the conference each year. And for that year, it was a culmination of different reasons, nobody came forward to host it. Now, as I was conference chair at the time, it would have been almost expected, really, that we host it at our institution. But we decided that we would take a bit of a gamble, take a bit of a risk and try running it online, not with a view to necessarily doing that every year in the future, but to try it out. And that was two reasons. One was because we didn't have a host, so here's a solution, but also because many of the people that come to these conferences organise conferences themselves. So this gave us a chance to try out what an online conference might look like. But what it also meant, though, was that we had a fixed idea in our minds of what this conference was supposed to be achieving. And as I say, it's a combination, the kind of superficial isn't the right word because it's important, but the overt reason, let's say, of coming together is to share ideas and new ways of doing things. But it is equally, at least half as important of its importance, is getting people the chance to come together and meet up with old colleagues and make new connections and so on. So we were wanting, and I just listened with absolute fascination to the previous speaker because so many of the things rang true, but were also slightly different perspective, I guess. Anyway, so what we did, I'll try and keep this short, not go on too much, but I do start talking a lot because I am quite interested in it, so I'm sorry if I get a bit rambling. I'll try to focus it as much as I can on the kind of practicalities and some tips if you're organising. Say about this conference, because we were replacing something people already had in their heads of what the conference should be, we tried to replicate as many of the things that we thought people found important. So having a poster presentation, that's something we always have, how we were going to do that online. Having it in a fixed period of time. Normally it would be 2 days face-to-face, but we did make it a little longer. I'll explain that why in a minute. And then working out what sort of support we should provide for presenters and participants before, during, and actually, as it turned out, afterwards as well. And the big important, as I say, the big worry really for people was how do we deal with the networking issue. So my kind of underlying premise to conferences is that we should recognise them as a form of teaching and learning, and think about the learning that we've made and the research that's been done into teaching and learning in higher education, and apply that to the way we run conferences. Because what I tend to see happening, or tended certainly in the past, is that we take a very didactic approach to conferences, even though we now know that just a pure transmission mode, as I'm doing now to you, is not necessarily the best way that we learn. So these are two pictures. The one on the upper picture is of a conference, the lower one is of a lecture theatre. Just random Google pictures, and apart from the fact that there's maybe a few more bald heads in the top picture, maybe slightly older profile there, it's pretty much the same. We stand at the front and we talk to groups of people. So because of that, I suggest that we can use the best practice that we know of, or the good approaches to teaching and learning when you think about a conference. So rather than doing what was the starting point for us with the 2019 conference, which was how do I replicate an in-person conference, is take a step back a bit and think, what are the aims? What are we trying to achieve with the conference? So for instance, if the ultimate aim is to get people together to have a bit of a party, and there's nothing wrong with this, this is just, you know, that's what some conferences are about. They're about community building, they're about connections. Then the approach you take to that when you do that online might be different from a conference where the principal purpose is to, say, launch a new product or a new idea. I'm just using these in the broadest senses. You know, so thinking about your aims rather than the starting point of how do I replicate what we've always done, is think about what it is we want to achieve. And then you can find, as we did, that some things you can't replicate, but actually there's some things you can do that you could never have done before, and or that you can do a lot better. So I like having pictures in slides. I don't know why I put this in. I just thought they looked cute. Anyway, 2 puffins for you to look at. So these are just some key lessons learned, highlights, if you like. I'm going to try and whip through these just to give you a flavour, really. But there's quite a bit of thought and consideration that could go behind each of these. And these are the things I keep in mind when moving forward now, as I'm thinking about, you know, the next conference that I'll be involved in. So Ken already touched on this issue of timing. Right. There's a huge difference between organising a conference in which the participants already live in exactly the same place geographically, or in time at least. So for example, if I was running a conference at my institution, I could be reasonably sure that everybody is in the same time zone. It's what is it? It's 1:45 here in the afternoon. That's what the time it is for everybody. That's a much easier thing to deal with than the 2019 conference that we ran, which was still only one country, but Canada's a big country and it spreads a long way east to west. So we have 4 time zones. So one of the issues was, how do we deal with, and one of the questioners for Ken touched on this, how do we deal with keeping a sense of community and excitement and happening in the moment, while not requiring some people to go at 4 in the morning and some people having to be up at 11 at night, let's say. So the way we dealt with it was, this is the reason we spread the time over 4 days instead of the usual 2. Because normally you're all there in the conference centre or whatever, and you pack as much as you can into that time, because that's the constraint that's caused by the time that you've got physically in the location together. Once you're online, it doesn't have to be. That's a constraint that disappears. It doesn't disappear completely though, because I do agree what I took from the question, that you want some sort of sense of excitement, and that countdown that Ken mentioned, I think that's great. But what we did anyway was to limit the days. There were 12 to 3 for us in Toronto, which is not quite in the middle, but you know, getting on towards. And that meant that people in Vancouver could start at 9 in the morning, and people over in Nova Scotia, they finished before 5. So it was within a working day. That would be different. That was a constraint that worked for us. But thinking about timing is really obviously an important one. Keeping it simple and familiar. This touches on the use of what technology you're going to use. Now, my background is literature as well, and education. That's my thing. I'm no technical whiz whatsoever. But I don't think you need to be, frankly. I think, you know, the technology has come on so much, and it's one of the things that COVID's given us, I guess, isn't even, you know, so many people are now familiar with Zoom. My mum is 89, she can use Zoom. That's not a sentence I thought I'd say a few months ago. But what I would say is keeping it simple and familiar is important in so many areas, if not least. So if you're running a conference within your institution and you have a virtual learning environment or a platform that you use, you might not like it, but this isn't the time to bring in something new. If it's something people are familiar with, then stick with it, would be my advice. Keeping things simple, simple in terms of structure. So if we structure this into 3 sessions on the first day, don't then have 5 or 6 on the second day, because that will just confuse people. Just keep things straightforward and simple. It's surprising how much things that seem straightforward when you're designing it, and they evolve, particularly if you're working in a committee, as I think most of us do. It seems simple and it seems a logic. When you come to it fresh and new, can seem really quite complicated. So that I'd say that really helped us to simplify things. Right, networking, that was absolutely vital to us, and that was the bit that people got upset about when we took the conference online. you know, what's going to happen with networking? And I would say this again also comes back to my initial point about what's your aim and your intention. This may be much less important in some conferences than others, and it might be even more important in others than it was in ours, but it was a key factor. And this was, remember, pre-COVID days. So we weren't doing this because people couldn't be together. We were doing this because we didn't have one central place for people to come to. So we did do, and I've not heard it described as hybrid, but I realise, of course, that's exactly what it is. That is what we did. We had a hybrid model. What we did was everything was online, obviously, so there was no central place, but all of the institutions were invited to run their own sort of mini get together. Because of the nature of the work that I do, I already mentioned that in some places there'll only be one or two people in an institution who are educational developers, but there might be a team of 10 or 11 in another. So the larger institutions invited people from the smaller ones to come and join them, or even just doing it within the institution. It meant that majority of people interacted with this as we're all doing, I'm assuming we're all doing, certainly as I'm doing, talking to my computer. We had some people doing that, but we had groups sometimes as large as 20 people all in one place, all watching and engaging with it up on a big screen, which meant when it stopped, they could then talk to each other. And so even though the conference itself was over a limited period of time each day, that seemed to matter. But there are many other ways of encouraging this networking. And this is why I again come back to thinking about this in a kind of framework of teaching and learning, you know, that you want to have interaction. The main interaction is, at the moment, the only interaction really that you're getting is me talking to you. If I had more time, and you know, ideally, I would like not only to have you talking to me, which hopefully we'll have with the questions, but also you talking to each other. And it's that sort of networking that can be lost in this setup if we don't build it in some ways. So there's lots of ways, and you know, obviously Ken's given loads, and I'm sure Peter's going to come up. We'll be sharing others as well. But all I'd say at this moment is just thinking about that and how you can enable people to interact together. That was an attempt of me to interact there with my co-presenters. I hope you like that. Anyway, then these thank you, Peter. It's very weird talking into a computer. I know I've done this so much, but it never stops being weird. Anyway, so in terms of the sessions, this is more about the, you know, how do you physically structure an online conference? Particularly if you're used to, well, I think for anybody it's going to be an issue. I think if you're used to structuring an online, if you're used to structuring an in-person conference and then you take that online, you suddenly think, oh, hang on a minute, do we have to have parallel sessions? Why were there all those, you know, I've been to conferences with 40, 50 parallel sessions, and it's a nightmare. How do you choose which one to go to? And if you're like me, halfway through, whichever session you've gone to, doesn't matter how brilliant it is, you're lurking feeling that, oh, what have I missed in all those other sessions? It doesn't have to happen with this. We can record things, or you can stagger them over a longer period of time. Perhaps that's an obvious thing to say. One of the lessons we learned with last year with that conference was that it's really useful to have two people at least in a session as the presenters. Even if it's only one person who's doing the talking, if you have somebody else monitoring the chat, if that's how you're getting questions in, that can help. But it also helps if anything goes wrong. So if one of you loses connection, the other one can keep going. And just having moral support. For those of you that are familiar with doing this, and I guess, as I say, we're all getting more and more familiar as time goes by, it might not seem such an issue, but certainly the presenters at our conference, a lot of them were very, very anxious about having to move on to this format of presenting online instead of in person. It's not to say they weren't anxious about presenting in person, because that brings anxieties of public speaking and so on for some people, but it was different. And the main concern was people don't want to look stupid. That's a lesson in life I will share with you. You know, nobody wants to look stupid, and if you're afraid that you're going to look silly because you lose connection, then you're going to feel anxious, and you know, it just doesn't go so well. So the more that you can do to help people to feel relaxed and confident, the better it will be. So another thing that we did was we made sure that people had the chance to familiarise themselves with the platform. We happen to use something called Big Blue Button, which I don't know how familiar you are with that. It's not a platform we used in my institution. It just happened to be one that one of the people on the committee knew somebody who was able to give us some technical support from that company, and that's what we went with, and it was free of charge. So those were the criteria. But it meant virtually everybody, this was a new platform, and helping people to get a familiarity with it helped a great deal. I've touched on posters. One of the solution we found for the posters was actually something that ended up being far better than the poster sessions had been in the past. So that picture, that's not our conference, but that's the sort of thing we would have had, a poster walk, if it was in person. But instead, what we did was we ran something, we called it a showcase, and that's still available, and it's, it'll just stay there forever. It's a collection of, in some cases, posters, but also resources like websites and videos and I can't remember what else, podcasts, all sorts of things that people made available. And then, so they were there online. And then during the conference itself, we had breakout rooms, and people could go into the breakout room of whichever session they thought, poster or resource they thought looked interesting, and have a chat with the presenter, just as you would, emulating what you do in person. So what we managed to do was capture the benefits, as we saw it, of the in-person poster, but added to it the advantage of being able to include all sorts of different resources that weren't just posters. Nobody had that problem of, how do you get your poster on the plane, and what happens when you can't get it, what do you do afterwards, and how do you get it home? None of those problems. The resources are all still there, and people can access them. So we're quite pleased with that. I'm sure it's not at all original, but we came up with it thinking it was a darn good idea, and it did go down quite well. This virtual room host, it's kind of it's a bit like having the two presenters. We tried both. So in some cases we had two people as presenters, but we also had a virtual room host. So this was somebody from the conference committee who was much more familiar, or likely to be more familiar with the conference as a whole, and as much as anything gave moral support. There's not a huge amount of technical support you can offer in the moment, but certainly just ensuring that people, same things like as people came in, can you keep your microphones muted, please, or can you not have your video on that? Little things like that, it can all go a long way to making people feel more comfortable. We did offer training sessions for presenters and participants. Most people at least had a look in, and online guides as well. Access to platform. I know this is not a relevant picture, just made me laugh. So it's the Hogwarts. Giving access to the software, as I say beforehand. What we also did was, and I'm not sure this was the right thing, and I'd be interested in hearing from other people's experience, but we made the focus the keynote. So the first live event was the keynote speakers for the conference. What it would have been in the in-person event would have been usually about half an hour, probably too long, of introductions from the hosts, senior administrators. So instead of that, we recorded a message from the executive of the committee welcoming people, which people could choose to watch before, any time. And that way, as I say, the timed in-person event was the first keynote, and that seemed to work okay. Might change that another time. The other thing is, in Canada, we always start events with a land acknowledgement. So acknowledge the land on which we are studying, meeting, living, and acknowledge the Indigenous nations who have looked after this land, for centuries before us. We always do that. I say we always, we've been doing this for the last couple of years. Because everybody was spread out, that actually became quite an issue. How do we have a land acknowledgement? Because we'll all be in different places. And so with that, we just encourage people to think about their own land and to have a conversation about, which land they were on. And that actually sparked quite an interesting discussion as well, that was not predicted. And then finally, the during and after, actually I said finally, I don't think it is the final thing, during and after. Each day, as the conference chair, I sent out an email to all of the participants. I've not been on a transatlantic cruise, but I think it's the sort of thing that the captain gives out each morning. I don't think it's he himself runs around with a bit of paper, but apparently you get a bit of paper through your cabin doors telling you the key events that are going to happen that day. And that's effectively what we did for the conference. Obviously, we weren't going anywhere, but it was a reminder to everybody of what was happening that day and the links, because that is a big issue. If you spread it over time, you don't have that immediacy of, oh, I'm in a new city or a different town, and I'm in a hotel room, and I'm at the conference. In your head, I'm at my desk, likely same desk I'm at every day. Oh, I've forgotten to go to that conference. Darn, it's easy to slip your mind because you're not physically there. So having that reminder seemed to help, and making it easy for people to get access with the links. And then of course, you have access to the recordings and presentations afterwards. Costs, virtually none. The only costs we had, we still paid an honorarium for the keynote speakers, as we would have done if they'd been in person, but so few costs. There is an impact on the society though, because usually the conference would make a bit of money. It's not a huge amount, but it does make a bit. It's only a small society, and that money is then used for things like bursaries to pay for graduate students, for instance, to come to conferences or to fund some small research projects. We didn't have that income stream because we reduced the cost to, it was just $50, and that so that was an advantage, but you'd have to think about that. And then finally, I'd say absolutely key is to have a really committed organisation committee to make this happen. You can't do it as an individual. Okay, so I've garbled through that a little bit. I'll just get that out. And I guess I don't know how to stop. There we go. Stop the screen share. There we go.
Great.
So,
thank you very much for that talk and for the and for the slides about the conference. I think you've got a couple questions up there already. So first, how many breakouts did you have simultaneously for the posters, and was that difficult logistically? And actually, what software did you use to move between the poster breakout rooms?
Yeah, so we did that. It was all in Big Blue Brother. Big Blue Brother. Oh my goodness. Big Brother, I'm thinking. Big Blue Button. It was all in BBB, and I'm just trying to remember because it was about 18 months ago. So I think we had more than one poster session, and I think we had about 10 or a dozen rooms each time. This is only a small conference. I think we had 200 participants, and not everybody presented a poster or a showcase item. It did work okay. I think it worked. Well, people were very forgiving because this was a new thing and we were exploring new ideas, so I'm sure there was a better way to do it. But the way we had it, we simply had the rooms. I'm just trying to remember how people could move around. I think it was just that, much like if you've got the people's images on the side of your screen, as I've got at the minute, I can see Eleanor, and then I've got smaller ones for each of the speakers. You just clicked on one of those and you went into the breakout room. And I was a presenter for one of those, and people just sort of drifted in, had a conversation, off they went. It felt very similar to doing it in person. Yeah.
And so
software.
Sorry, and it is Big Blue Button. Is that sorry, that's the right name? Yeah.
Big Blue Button. Yeah. It's a bit like Zoom.
Is he?
It was just again, I'm sure there are more sophisticated things now. Since then, my institution uses Zoom mostly, and so I've got much more familiar with that. And I would say everything that, as far as I recall, everything we did in Big Blue Button you could do in Zoom, and vice versa, from the point of view of how we ran it. Yeah.
Got a question. Did you ask the participants for feedback? Sorry.
Yeah, we did. Yes, so we did a big, yes. I didn't show you my very last slide, which is a bit depressing, which is that it doesn't matter what you do, some people are going to hate it. I'll just say that. That's, some people absolutely hate the online. So when we first said we were going to run it online, I did get quite a few slightly snippy, shall we say, emails from a couple of people who know me well, and they one was from a good friend actually, who said, right, well, I'm okay, do it online, fine, but I won't be coming. And I just said back to that person, well, I think that's a shame, because if you don't come, you won't know what you've missed, but also we won't benefit from hearing from you what you would have liked if it doesn't work as well as you would. What is it you don't get from the online that you would have valued, and maybe we could incorporate that in the future. So anyhow, we did a survey afterwards, and the majority of people who came did appreciate it, and they enjoyed it, and they were full of praise. But they were a captive audience in that they'd chosen to take part in the conference. So we didn't survey people who didn't come, which I think is always an issue, you know, with that sort of thing. And certainly the following year, so February that's just gone, immediately before the COVID lockdown, we had our conference for 2020, and it was back being in person. And some people were saying they would like to have alternate years online and others not. So it's a real mixed bag. And I do think that attitudes will have changed after this, you know, the last 3 months of this experience, one way or the other. You know, maybe people are absolutely sick of being online, or maybe not. But I have to say, we absolutely had the largest number of people who were able to come. We had the largest number of people coming for the first time to that conference compared to any of the in-person ones. And it was mainly the cost issue and also the time away from the office, because obviously you're not paying flights, hotel bill, and the actual time away from the office as well, which I don't think we always factor in. So it made it much more, I thought we made it much more actionable in terms of access. Yeah.
I think Bart is just flagging up another technology hop-in. I should probably say as well that we've got a list of some different possible virtual platforms. We don't actually have Big Blue Button on it, but I'll add that. And some pros and cons of different platforms that we'll send around afterwards. So I think Hop-in is one of them. Another one that's apparently very good for large multi-stream conferencings is one called Shindig, SHINDIG. So I'll send round after this some kind of pros and cons for each of the different platforms.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Oh, thank you so much for the for that talk and the presentation.